Right, so recording's on, so you're welcome to ask questions, but obviously, yeah, remember that everything is recorded. So same format, I'm going to speak for around 20 minutes on the content. Then, yeah, 10 minutes or so questions. And then we'll see if anyone's got a deal, we'll discuss it. Otherwise, I'll go through go through a few things on the deal calculator that we use, and to look at some examples of BRR, RR type deals. So today we're going to be looking very briefly at title splitting. So the title is leveraging title splitting for enhanced value, and it's one of the property strategies that we can use for basically making money on property. It's possible to do this entirely, in fact, as a paper exercise. Just adding more people. So it's possible to do it entirely like sort of administratively, like buying a property, title splitting, and then selling or refinancing and getting added value. So it can almost be a desk job sort of thing. Or it can be combined with a full-on property project, which could be like a property renovation property, could be ground up development, or it could be buying some commercial unit offices, for example, and splitting them up into apartments. Or it could be buying, well, we're going to see more examples in a moment. So what is title splitting? Well, perhaps first of all, to go back to absolute basics, what is a title? A title is a legal title. So it's basically a legal document which is stored online at a government organization called the Land Registry, which stores the ownership of all properties and land in the UK. And all property has a title which states, typically there's two parts. It states who owns it, and then there's documents that describe, typically plans that describe the limits of the property, and sometimes it can be only on one floor or different parts, or it can have different restrictions attached to it, and all that is in the title. Quite often we find that if, for example, a developer builds a block of, let's say, 8 or 10 flats, or buys, it's quite common in some areas of the country, buys a disused church and divides it up into flats. If the purpose of the developer is to create the flats and then rent them out, when the building is originally purchased, because if it's like a church or a piece of land, it's going to be on one single legal document, one single title. And if the purpose is, if the purpose is only to rent out, it's not needed to be able to rent it, to create separate titles. So this can be planned down the line, typically to add value or to be able to sell individual parts of a property. So title splitting is the process of dividing a single property into multiple titles, and commonly used for multi-unit buildings, large houses, mixed-use properties, and we'll see some other applications as well of this. So why to consider title splitting? So several advantages. So increasing market value. So let's say we've got a block of 8 flats, going back like to my example of like a converted church building, or it could be some offices, or it could have been a purpose-built block of flats. That the value as a block typically is smaller than the value of each individual flat. So by splitting the title into having a title for each flat, then it's possible to increase the value. And that can serve two purposes. If we want to sell, we can sell off individually the flats, or we can go back to the lender and we can get borrowing on each individual flat rather than the block as like a complete rental unit consisting of 8 flats on the same title. The next thing, enhanced rental income, that in reality is not so much linked to title splitting, so we won't go into detail on that. And then yet flexibility for sale or refinance. So obviously we can't sell a flat out of a block of 8 if they're all on the same title. So we have to split into individual titles in order to sell. And when we're refinancing, we can refinance on individual units rather than the whole lot. There are other like little advantages as well. Is let's imagine that we've got a 12-bedroom HMO, or we've got a large house that is could be 12-bedroom HMO, but we're in Article 4 area that says if it's, for example, more than 4 bedrooms, we have to go through planning permission, and potentially we might not get that planning permission. We can create 3 individual, so we can title split, create 3 individual dwellings, each of 4 bedrooms, and then operate each of them as a mini HMO to not have to go through planning to get a sui generis HMO. So types of property that are suitable for title splitting. So it could be a large house that we convert into multiple flats, again with the idea being that the sum of the value of the flats is more than the house by itself. As an aside, that's not always the case. I was looking recently, probably like a couple of months ago, at it was a terraced house, a medium-sized terraced house in Fulham. That's an area of London, just outside the centre of London. And it was like an okay terraced house. And we noticed that the house next door had been extended a little and converted into 2 individual flats. And we were thinking about doing the same, basically buying it, developing it, adding value as 2 and creating 2 separate flats and selling it on. But when we did our initial due diligence, so when we were initially looking at the values of the property, what we actually discovered is that if we were going to sell them on, we will get more money by creating a really nice terraced house with like a sort of balcony and larger space. The price per square meter it would have ended up being like a 140 square meter house. The price per square meter up for the 140 square meters house, I think it would have been something like 8,000 pounds per square meter. However, if we converted it into 2 flats, it will cost a little more because we have to do fire paneling and all sorts of stuff between the flats, and we would have got something like 7,000 per square meter. So on this project, we didn't go ahead because there wasn't enough margin in there anyway. But to flip this, title splitting would have actually taken away value rather than added it. But then there's lots of cases where the creating flats maybe in different areas, potentially more like sought after or maybe closer to the centre of London, where definitely worth converting houses into multiple flats. Another example of property suitable for title splitting is commercial buildings with separate retail or office spaces. So we'll put the commercial on one title. Maybe we can create 2 flats above. We'll put each of those on a title, and then that's great for the refinance potentially, as well as selling off. Blocks of flats, and notice it says here where individual leases can be created. We're not going to have time to go into this, but if we're creating title splits that are basically in the same vertical stack, then obviously each one cannot have its own freehold, because freehold is basically the land that on which the property is built. So we have to also create leases for each flat, and then either we have a freehold that is owned by someone else or the original company, or we have shared freehold. Generally, these days we're looking at shared freehold because there's no advantage for an investor in having freehold. Or in fact, I said that, so I'm going on. Hopefully, this is interesting and useful. If there is a possibility, for example, if you're converting a building into 3 flats, keep having shared freehold. That means each owner of each flat has a share of the freehold. However, retaining the freehold, if there's future possible developments, so let's imagine you've got 3 floors, and in a few years' time, because of other developments in the area, you could go to planning and add something above, so we call that airspace development, then it's worth keeping the freehold, because the freeholder has the rights to create additional things. Whereas if it's shared freehold, all the shared freeholders have a say in it and also a share of the profit. So blocks of flats where we can create individual leases, houses with annexes or outbuildings where we've got the possibility of converting those outbuildings into separate accommodation. And a little similar, houses or buildings which have got like a large plot of land, and we can divide off and create a smaller plot of land which has got no building on, and then keep the land on a separate title that's got the building on. When we do that, in fact, there's 3 levels in this scenario of making money. So when we split the title, if we're just talking about land, we might have increased a bit of value because we've got a piece of land that can be split off, but we probably can't immediately make money because we can't go and refinance that based on the fact that we've got land that's on a separate title. However, one thing that we can do is to sell that land without planning permission to a developer who thinks that they can get planning permission for it. And we'll make, let's say, a small amount of money. Generally, if we've got the possibility, we'll make a lot more money by applying for planning. And obviously, if we get planning permission for building a house on that land, then that gives a significant extra value. So that's our second level of value. And then the third level of value is actually building out, for example, that house on the land. But in practice, between level 2, which is having the land with planning permission and on a separate title, basically ready to sell to a developer who's got his team and wants to go in there and build something. Generally, I prefer stopping at level 2, which means selling off the land with the planning permission, because the additional gain, actually building it out, there's maybe some gain there. It's basically the margin of the on the build. I'd rather the builder look after all of that and all the problems and make his full margin on there. It was only in the case if it's buy and hold, where it's possible to build out, refinance, basically get all the money out, and in that case have a free, in inverted commas, asset, which is generating cash flow. So yeah, those are the thoughts on, and yeah, some of the purposes, ways, or in which we're going to be doing title splitting. Things to bear in mind. We're just going to touch on these and note that they exist. Planning permission can be, again, planning permission is separate from titles, but it can be linked in that if we're creating individual flats within a building, then we have to go through full planning permission and building regulations. And historically, there are like blocks of flats which have been done by developers that, where if you're looking at buying properties like that and just thinking it's fine, I can title split and just do a paper exercise, beware as to whether those were done like fast and never went through building regulations, and you could end up potentially, when looking to sell them on, find that there's a lot of work to do to get them compliant with planning and building regulations. So don't ignore those. Land registry procedures obviously have to be followed, and that's specialist work. And there are specialists. Any solicitor can theoretically, well, any land or solicitor conveyancer can theoretically deal with a title split, but it's better to use ones that have specific expertise in that area. Also, if it's involved with leases as well. Remember what we said earlier, if we're creating blocks of flats, then we're obligatory going to have leases and then freehold or shared freehold. And another thing to bear in mind, mortgage and lender approval requirements. If we've got a mortgage on a property that's on one title, doing a title split does require lender approval. It's not necessarily a problem. Sometimes we're buying commercial or mixed-use properties that already have two titles, and we're buying it on one mortgage as one like property together. And but the lender obviously needs to be aware of that and to approve that, not to find out last minute that the property is on two titles. Title splitting process. So obviously we're going to assess the property's potential, a bit like I was saying, looking at this house in Fulham, looking at the financials, and after probably an hour and a half, looking at property filter and other stuff, just determining that it's not a good deal. Engaging, property lawyer and surveyors are required as well. Applying for necessary permissions when planning is needed. Having the lease agreements, title plans drawn up, registering the new titles, and then refinancing or marketing or just holding on to the individual units. Financial implications and cost. And this again is why it's really important to employ experienced professionals, especially with things like stamp duty liability. When there's it's possible to do a title split without transfer of ownership. It's also possible, and generally it's done with transfer of ownership, but be very careful when there's transfer of ownership, even if it's to related parties, there can be stamp duty, and that can obviously be quite high depending on the value of the properties. The title splitting is not like do it yourself. You can sort of, if you've got the right training, and we actually now have a full training package on the BRR strategy and everything that's needed to successfully do that. With proper education, it's possible to, basically by yourself, obviously you still need a good broker and standard solicitor, but you can do all the BRR stuff, finding below market value, adding value, all this sort of stuff, thinking about refinance, different ways of renting out by yourself. You can do that, do it yourself with the right education. but you can't do it yourself on title split. So if you're going to be doing this, even from the analysis point of view, you can do like the first thoughts and looking at things. But when it gets to a certain level, typically even before you're going to be doing a deal, you could well be giving your solicitor friend maybe £1,000 to actually look in more detail and consider the implications, check the existing titles, and advise on the correct order of doing things. And take into account, obviously, it needs to have proper surveys, measured surveys, and redrawing of plans. Capital gains tax can be an issue if you're selling off and need to take that into account and calculate that, because here we're talking about immediate selling off of flats. And obviously there's a pro rata basis if we're selling 1 out of 4, for example, but all those calculations have to be done properly, and we need to be aware of that. And changes, yeah, to mortgage and refinancing options. The finance options on 8 flats with individual titles is completely different to the finance possibilities on a block of 8 flats under 1 title. Common pitfalls to avoid. I like this serious man with the with the finger. I like the choice of that picture. Yeah, misjudging planning permissions, underestimating costs, especially all the legal costs associated and timescales, failing to consult with lenders at early stages, not understanding the complexity of leaseholds, and especially if you're retaining the freehold, make sure that you retain all the rights for things like the airspace development or any other potential things that could add value to the property. Maybe it's an end terrace on a busy road and you've got the possibility of putting a advertising panel on there that can actually be quite lucrative. Make sure that in the freehold that you conserved that right. Yeah, so not using solicitors experienced in title splitting and not doing the correct timing because you haven't taken proper legal and tax advice. So that was my 20 minutes, which is probably 25 minutes. So open to any questions or anyone that's maybe had specific experience on doing title splitting that would like to share something about it.
Trevor, if you've got what we call a multi-unit freehold block, right? So that's a block of flats already partitioned into units which are available for rent, right? But the whole thing's on a single freehold title. Is it a no-brainer? I mean, put it this way, in London, pretty much everything in that sort of situation is already on a leasehold, right? So elsewhere, is it a
It actually
no-brainer
won't
to?
be on a lease if it's a freehold block of flats, even in London, unless it's in an area like Mayfair on the Crown properties where
Right,
it's only
yeah. I
leasehold.
mean,
It's
maybe
quite
I've spoken a
likely
bit
going to be
remiss there.
on a freehold.
Yeah, maybe I've spoken a bit remiss, but most of what I've come across in London, okay, granted that you got share of freehold and stuff like that, but most of what I've come
It's
across in
more in
London,
reality, I would say in London, there aren't that many blocks that are not that haven't been initially set up as leasehold.
yeah,
And often what we find in London is that a developer might have made a block of 20, 40 or 80 flats. And quite possibly, depending on their financial situation, they'll put them all into onto leases. They keep the freehold and quite likely might keep 10, 20 of the flats for
mm.
themselves for ongoing income or potentially to, yeah, well, for capital appreciation.
I mean, the point of my question is it a no-brainer kind of elsewhere? You got blocks of, let's say, between 4 flats and 8 flats, right? So we're not talking about big flats, but if they're already partitioned, um, Is it a no-brainer to do the title split?
It's a no-brainer to do the title split, but it's not a no-brainer to check that everything is compliant, because you
Yes,
can do the
agreed.
title
Yep.
split, so
Yeah.
you can end up with 8 titles,
Yeah.
and then you can end up with the lender saying, even an individual lender, so you want to sell it, and or actually even worse, you got a property that's, for example, let's imagine you've got a property that's a single block that you own. You've got a fire alarm system in there that's been signed off and everyone's happy. You now title split. You go back to your lender and say, well, you should do this beforehand. You say to the lender, would you be okay now in lending against, rather than a block of flats, a portfolio of 8 or 10 individual flats? And the lender, even if he's already said yes, the lender will now say, these are on separate titles. We're really considering them as separate flats. We're going to do some extra due diligence. Get an up-to-date fire risk assessment. Show me that you've got all the proper fireboarding, etc. And the same thing will happen if you want to sell one of those. The um, the buyer's solicitor is going to say, show me the building regs sign-offs. Show me also potentially the fire safety for the building and everything. And you're now at a different level, because rather than one landlord doing whatever they want to do, sort of thing, even being compliant, it's no longer the case. Now you've got individual leaseholders, you've got the freeholder. You must have a management company that has legal responsibility for the safety of people living in that block, rather than the landlord himself being responsible for the safety. So there's additional layers. So it's not just a paper exercise. It could be fine if it was purpose built, if it was built to building regulations on the basis of 8 individually occupied flats with all the appropriate safety, then that's fine, and it was signed off as such. That's fine. But if it wasn't the case, you could end up with costs and problems.
If it's already built as flats intended for rental with their own individual utilities, fire safety for the building in the common areas, etc. Um, Obviously you still need to do your due diligence, but I mean, am I missing something there? Is it the case that once you title split, um, and a period of time, sorry, I'm kind of I'm what I'm trying to understand, Trevor, is whether I guess if you've got a newly built block of flats, right? Let's say it was a building that had flats put in it, um, with all the latest regulations to allow those flats to operate as rented units. Okay.
In that case, you're
Ha-
fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just, yeah.
I have come across quite a few um, blocks, not in London, but where they're like sort of, it's basically been builders that have built them. Or when I mentioned these conversion of churches and things, it's like local builders that have bought buildings, or maybe some commercial, it might be some large pub or something, that they've converted into 5 or 6 flats. And they might have done it 10, 20 years ago. It's got some fire alarm system in, it's got boarding, but it's not it's not up to standard. It hasn't got like proper sound insulation and things that maybe weren't an absolute requirement at the time. Or it might have had retrospective planning. So it might have had planning that was done to basically after it was done to get it. It might have a certificate of lawful development, for example,
Mm.
but it doesn't have. Although it's not illegal, as long as it's got like certain things in it, it's not strictly speaking illegal to rent out a flat where you can hear exactly what the neighbours are doing and everything else like that. But when you come to selling it, or if works were done on it maybe 10 years ago and those works weren't signed off, it's quite possible that no one's ever caught that. And if
Yeah, no,
there's
I think I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah, so I mean, as an example, like one of the considerations me and my business partner did when we're looking at a title split is one of the things we came up was the flats weren't necessarily compliant with the nationally described space standards, the NDSS,
yes.
right? So the question mark was, would someone buying flat after we'd done the title split come across an issue with a lender saying, no, property is not compliant, I can't lend. So, I mean, in that situation, I did take advice from finance brokers
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, because the last thing we wanted is a title split where we wanted the ability to sell, to deleverage,
Yeah,
finance, etc., and to find that a prospective purchaser,
yeah,
whether it's an investor or a homeowner,
yeah. Generally, lenders aren't
can get.
fussy about the room sizes unless it's a new build.
Yeah,
A lot of lenders don't lend on stuff that's below 35 square meters.
yeah.
Um,
But the safety side is obviously quite crucial, right?
that's right. No, you
Yeah,
can't do any
yeah,
shortcuts on
definitely.
the
Yeah,
safety side.
yeah.
And
Okay.
yeah, and you might end up with a building that was done like 20 years ago. That even though, for example, the fire alarm has been kept in working order by the local electrician, but it might, based on current standards, you might need to put a new fire escape stairs, for example, and that might be 10,000 or 20,000 that you hadn't planned to do. So best to find out at the beginning.
I mean, does that come into negotiations though with the purchase of a block like that? Like, not necessarily with a title split, but when you're acquiring a block as an
Yeah,
investor?
absolutely. The thing to do there is agree a price,
Yeah,
then get your pay, say, look, we've agreed the price, but I need to pay the fire risk assessor to go in and do his
yeah,
work. If the
yeah,
fire risk assessment comes up with everything fine or some 3 fire doors that don't fit properly, then that's fine. But if the fire risk assessor says, look, it's no longer, you need to change all the windows and put fire escape and do some boarding around these stairs, and it's going to cost you £30,000, then you go back to the seller and say, look, let's take off £30,000.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
fine. And often they'll agree to it because they're not aware of that. And it's a fact. It's not something that
yeah,
you've invented. You've got a official fire risk audit in front of you that states that.
yeah.
Anyway, let's see if anyone else has got a question.
Yeah, hi Trevor. Paul here.
Yeah, hi, Paul.
Yeah, how you doing? You okay? Thank you
Yeah, I'm
firstly
fine.
for the insightful presentation. I've got two questions actually off the back of the points you mentioned in terms of the value add. So
Yeah,
firstly, um, the scenario you gave about sort of the 3 points of adding value to land. So whether it's buying it, developing it, or just getting the planning.
that's right.
Um,
Yes.
if you were looking at a property, the first question is, can planning be applied for prior to purchasing, or like, is it a case where you have to, that has to be progressing in parallel with the planning? Can that be done? So that's the first question. And then the second question actually I have is in relation to the title split specifically, whereby this is a bit of a silly question, but it just crossed my mind. Can you apply for a title split with a delay completion?
Right. That's
So yeah,
interesting. It's
two
not, by
questions.
the way, no question is silly. Um, so don't anyone think that a question is a silly one. Uh, Sorry, remind me the first question, because I'd already got the answer, but I've forgotten the answer now.
So the first question was with regards to getting planning, if you're
I
looking at a
remember now. It's
property.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So generally, whilst it is actually, you can, strangely, you can see a building across the road from you, and you can put a planning application in for it. You don't
Interesting.
have to be the owner of the
Okay.
of a building to be able to put a planning application in. And conversely, any planning that is granted can be implemented by obviously the legal owner or the person who has legal rights on the property. However, in
Okay.
practice, what we do, basically got two things. Ideally, we agree an option to purchase subject to planning. So what
Okay.
we agree with the seller is that the seller will sell at a specific price, subject to us getting the planning, and then we're paying for the planning. If the planning
Yeah.
doesn't go through, then we can walk away from the deal, and we haven't, well, we paid for the planning. We have
Right.
to pay an option fee, but that can be £1. Obviously, that's free negotiation with the seller. We might pay a bit more. We'll say, look, we'll give you 10,000. We want 2 years option because we want to have the time to be able to go to appeal if our initial planning is rejected. And
Right. Okay.
often also, if typically as well, we'll offer a bit more money to the owner if we are asking for an option rather than purchasing outright.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and
So in
sometimes
essence, you're
depending,
buying
because
time.
yeah, when we're doing this, by the way, I'll do more questions. We won't do a deal this time, a deal analysis. So because I think there's some interesting questions coming up here. Is, let's say we'll also take a view on what are the chances of obtaining planning permission. To take that view, what we're going to be doing is consulting 2 or 3 local planners. We're actually I'm looking at with a business partner to deal in South London, where there's a house and there's land next to the house on the same title with enough space to be able to build, but it's in a conservation area, and there's some risk of not getting the planning. But what we did there is we actually phoned 3 local planning consultants to ask their opinion on what they think the possibility, explain where it was, what they, obviously there's always a little risk when you're explaining that, because you could be alerting other people to potentially go and put an offer into it, but that's part of the game. Generally, planning consultants are keeping confidentiality. And if we think that there's a, let's say we consider there's a 75 or 80% chance of getting the planning, then we might potentially put an offer, say to the owner, look, we can buy this land at 80,000 without planning, and we take a risk on it. Or can we have an option? If you give us an option on it for 2 years, we'll buy it from you at 120 if we get the planning. I mean, these are just figures out of the blue, but that's typically the way that we'll do it. Exchange and delayed completion can be done. So we can do, and there's also a variant as well, which I'll mention as well. So exchange and delayed completion is obviously where we exchange. Typically, that means we're committing to purchase. So exchange is not an option to purchase. Exchange means we agree that we will purchase. We're giving typically 10% of the deposit. That 10%, it can be anything, by the way, is generally 10%, but there's no law that says on exchange it's 10%. It can be 1%, it can be 20%. And then on the conditions of the exchange, we will complete within a certain amount of time. It is theoretically possible to put a condition of completion or basically a break clause that will say we have the possibility of going back on the exchange if we don't obtain planning permission. But generally, that's almost always done with a option agreement, because an option agreement is cleaner and it has the similar effect. And sometimes on also looking at this is a quite large plot of land in Sutton in Surrey, and there the actual seller is inviting options. So basically is inviting offers on options subject to planning. But obviously here we're looking at like building 40 flats. When I say we, that's not myself. It'd be something that would be selling on to a developer, because we like find things also for developers. But there, the planning costs for getting the planning for 40 apartments in that area, it could well be 50, 60, 70,000 pounds to spend on the planning costs. So there's that planning risk. But then it's whoever puts in the highest option over, say that if we get the planning within 24 months, we'll buy the land. Coming back to the completion, so the exchange with delayed completion, sometimes we can also do that if we might be 100% sure that we can get the planning, because it might be something under permitted development, for example, but we still need to jump through all the different hoops to be able to start building. And so we can get delayed completion simply to not have to fork out for the land or for the building until we've actually completed it and finish the development. Although the downside there is, if there's exchange with delayed completion, we can't do normal borrowing, because when there's delayed completion, we have control of the property potentially if you agree that on exchange, but we don't have ownership, so we can't borrow with a first charge security against the property. So hopefully that answered both questions.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, very much.
Right.
I think with regards to in terms of the borrowing on the option, it's just sort of weighing which is more of a better route, in the event of you're trying to sort of find a more cost-effective way of going around it. But it
Yes,
seems
yes,
like the option agreement seems a much better and cleaner way of going around
yes, yes.
the transaction.
And another nice way, or another way, let's say, of dealing with this sort of potential scenario is joint venture with the owner of the property or the land. So when the owner does, and that just as a little advertisement, that is one of the specialities that we do. We advise in like setting up joint ventures, and we do joint ventures ourselves, is if the owner doesn't need the money straight away. So the owner's got the building or the land, but they don't need it for their income because they've got income from some other source. So they have other property, but they were just looking to sell it and move on and maybe do something else. Then it's possible to agree to, there's different ways of setting up the joint venture, but it could be transferring the property into a joint venture company where the existing owner has shares in there. And then we develop out the project, and the owner then gets paid for the property. Basically, the owner will get paid the asking price, or let's say the agreed price. So let's say we agree that the property is worth 500,000 if we were to buy it straight away in its current state, and we can build it out up to a GDV of, let's say, a couple of million, and there's 400,000 profit on that once we've paid all the costs. We can say to the owner, look, your property is worth 500. We'll do a joint venture. We don't pay you any money straight away. You allow us to use the property as security for the development funding. And when we're finished, we either refinance to keep ourselves or we sell on. And in either case, the profit there, which is 400,000, the owner gets half of it, so 200,000. So the owner, instead of getting the 500,000 at the beginning, he gets 700,000 because of the profit share. If for some reason we don't only make 200 of profit, then the owner gets 500 plus 100, so less profit share, but he's like in it for more value than if he were to sell it straight away. And that can quite often work if the owner needs the money because he's got some debt or he wants to buy something else. Then we're not going to propose that because it's stupid proposing something that doesn't work for the owner. But if, depending on the owner's situation, that could work, then that's fine. Let's go ahead and propose that.
Thanks a lot,
Are
Trevor.
there any other questions?
Hi, Trevor. I've got a question. If
Yep.
you hear me, okay?
Yeah, I can hear. Yes.
Yeah, cool. So when you do the title split, after you do the title split, and you come to refinancing the property at a later date, do they refinance it? Will lenders just consider that title? Will they consider the whole block? Say if it's a block of flats, how will they go about, valuing it essentially?
Generally, they're going to be valuing it on the basis, assuming that each flat is now on its separate title.
Yeah.
Even if you as the owner still own those 8 flats, they're
Yeah.
going to consider it as 8 separate units.
Okay.
And so it'll still be like not exactly, it can be one mortgage, but for 8 properties.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the same way that, for example, I happen to have 3 houses that I bought in the same limited company,
Yeah.
and I've got on a single mortgage across those 3 houses.
Okay.
But that's simple. Obviously, they're different houses in different places, but it's
Yeah.
exactly the same thing. If those were 3
Okay.
flats in the same building, it would be
Yeah.
the same thing. The valuer came separately to value each property.
Yeah. Okay.
And the lending is based on the value of the 3 properties.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
The nice thing is that when you do a portfolio mortgage, generally you only pay 1 application fee
Oh, that's
and
nice.
only 1 broker fee. So you have got a bit of economy of scale, but the method of valuation is the same as on an individual
Okay.
flat.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other last question? Right. Well, thank you for participating. The content will be on, it'll be on YouTube probably a little bit later today or tomorrow. And next week, we're going to be looking at navigating planning permissions, like a very brief overview of how we can add value by doing things with planning. Right, so thank you all and have a good evening.
Great. Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Trevor.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.